today, again, we're going to look at what I think are really much more interesting and more, I don't want to use the word profound, but they're more serious. That I think they're harder to deal with, these objections, than the ones we've seen before. And I have them listed here, right? So one objection against Sartre is that his philosophy is a form of subjectivism. So we'll talk about what that means. What is subjectivism? Is his philosophy that? Solipsism. That's a term we've actually seen before. You might have forgotten, but we covered it when we were going over Descartes. He had, at one point, he didn't want to do this, but he had committed himself to solipsism. So we'll review what that means, and we'll talk about how that applies to Sartre and whether or not he's a solipsist, how he would respond to that objection. Then there's also this other objection that basically, if what he says is what Sartre says is true, then it makes all the choices that we make arbitrary. And so there's really, what that really amounts to is there's no standard to base your choices on. You don't know whether one's right or wrong, so it doesn't matter what you choose. And if I'm judging someone else for their behavior, I have no standard to judge them if I'm going to praise them or condemn them. Because there are no a priori universal values in Sartre's view, there's no standard for judgment. So he's got to respond to that somehow. And this last one, too, is pretty hardcore. It's kind of like, well, why should I care about anybody else? That's pretty serious. If Sartre wants to be an activist and be politically active, as he was, and to advocate for the rights of people who he sees are treated unfairly, and fight for justice, why does he care about that? Like, doesn't everybody just invent their own meaning? What if meaning in my life is depriving people of justice? I want to be evil. Why should I care about what I'm getting off on it? Why should I care? So he has to respond to that, because these are pretty, I think, valid criticisms given what he said so far. But let's look at what he said so far, just to review. I don't want to dwell on this too much, because this is all we did last time. But this is the basic theory, right? He says his existence precedes his essence. That's true for all human beings. We exist before we can be defined. We don't really have a clear definition. We don't have a purpose the way this book has a purpose. Before it was ever created, before it existed, someone published, translators got together and said, Nietzsche's getting really influential in philosophy. We need to make more English translations, scholarly editions. All these people had an idea and a reason for creating this. And now it's here to fulfill that purpose. For Sartre, we're not that way. We just exist, right? Here we are. And why? Who knows? But we've got to make something of ourselves, and that responsibility is up to us. Otherwise, we're really nothing, as he puts it. So we have to define who we are. And that heavy burden of responsibility is not just for ourselves, but for all mankind, hence the anguish. We feel anguish when we make our choices, because we realize that when I decide to be a certain way or act a certain way or to uphold certain values, that those values and those ways of being are going to run up against other people who might dispute me, who might support me or think otherwise. And that realization, that feeling of that as we make our choices, this is the anguish that Sartre is speaking of. Now, abandonment in your book, or forlornness, as I prefer to, because I'm so used to that translation, is the idea that one is alone. The student who comes to talk to Sartre to ask for advice, for Sartre, he's just looking for outside confirmation. Ultimately, he's the one that must decide. He's condemned to be free, and he has to make that choice alone. He has to make it without really knowing whether or not it's ultimately valid universally. There's no way to decide. No book of ethics can tell him, as Sartre puts it. The Kantian ethics says, don't treat people as a means to an end. But how can he do that? Inevitably, he's going to treat somebody. He could care for his mom, but then he's dismissing the other. The Christian doctrine says, take the rugged path. But how does he know which one is going to be the most rugged path, or the narrow way? So for Sartre, ultimately, these decisions lie on his shoulder. Now, one thing that Sartre is very critical of humans, us for, is fleeing from this, denying this, and not taking on this burden ourselves. But ultimately, again, this student, even if he decides to just follow someone's advice, he chose to follow the advice. He's on his own here. He's abandoned, right? He's forlorn. He doesn't have access to some sort of universal rule book with, validation for everything he does. He can't blame it on, anybody else. It's his choice. Now, despair is this realization that once I get involved in the world, once I get engaged with other people and take part in movements of any kind or projects of any kind, and inevitably these will involve other people, there's no guarantee that things are going to work out the way I envision them. In fact, I have to sort of just take stock of what I can control and what I can't, and be able to live with that, and be able to live with my choices regardless of how they what the consequences of those choices might be, right? How they work themselves out in the world as I make my choices and move through the world. So I think, when we were talking about anguish last time, I mentioned the example of that Sartre uses of the military officer, and he can't help but feel anguish when he's trying to decide how to order his troops into battle. What sort of strategy should he use? He can't help but feel that responsibility for their lives. He can't make a foolish move. He can't make some hasty move. He can't risk their lives unnecessarily. He's going to feel that anguish, but he doesn't know how it's going to happen. No matter how shrewd of a military mind he is, there's always the unpredictable, and he'll never know what's going to happen in the future. So no matter what happens, he has to be able to justify his choice. And even if it doesn't work out, he has to say, well, given the circumstances, I'm still like, yes, it was wrong. If I knew more, if I knew what was going to happen, I might have done it differently, but I didn't. So at the time, this is what I did. And so despair is sort of the acceptance of that, right? This feeling that, hey, I know that things are uncertain. I can accept it. Okay. All right. So this is Sartre's overall philosophy as he presents it in the essay. And along the way, last class I mentioned a few of the objections of the communists and how he would respond to them. But now, let's look at these other objections, which he turns to later on in the lecture. And I think that these are, like I said earlier, much more serious and I think stronger objections philosophically. The first one is that his philosophy, it's being accused of just being another form of subjectivism. So what does that mean? Well, now typically when you hear this word subjectivism in philosophy, it's usually in an ethics course, or at least in the context of a discussion of ethics. And usually when you're talking about subjectivism in that context, you're talking about, what you might call moral subjectivism, which is really just a form of relativism. So relativism in ethics is the idea that there are no moral truths. All truths are relative. And moral subjectivism is probably one of the most extreme forms of relativism. So probably the more popular version of relativism is a version known as cultural relativism. And what that says is that right and wrong, good and bad, when we talk about ethics, morals, what's evil, what's considered good or right, all we're talking about are cultural standards, that there really are no right answers. It's all relative to your culture. If you grew up in culture A, you have certain beliefs about what's good and what's right and what's bad and what's improper. You grew up in culture B, you might have similar beliefs, but you'll have others that are different, right? So it depends on where you grew up and where you came from. Now, some understand cultural relativism as just like a anthropological theory, and if you're an anthropologist or a social scientist, a sociologist, you might call yourself a cultural relativist, but you do believe there are values, and what you really mean is that no, different cultures do, and that's just a fact. Different cultures do have different values, but the philosophical position says there is no right answer, and it's just a matter of culture. Now, moral subjectivism, this is the more extreme form of relativism. It says it's not even your culture. It's actually just you by yourself. Because even within cultures, you can see within one culture, you might have different people, different groups, or different individuals within that culture that have their own values and different values within one culture. Now, some would say, well, how do you define culture? You're like, what if they don't have the same shared? What do you? Why do you even call them one society? But obviously, look at America. We've got a society of people that's United States of America, one nation, under God, indivisible, all that stuff. And but yet we have all these different religious beliefs. People have different religious beliefs, different political affiliations, et cetera, et cetera. And so the idea is that when it comes to ethics, the subjectivist in ethics is going to say that it's just all personal. Everything is your own view, like to each his own or her own. Okay, so Sartre is being accused of being a subjectivist in this sense, and I always thought he was too. I always thought, yeah, well, aren't you a subjectivist? Don't you say, you know, we exist before we have an essence and we define what that essence is and it's our choice, we're forlorn, I own it, that kind of thing. But he actually denies it. He says, oh no, I'm not a subjectivist, at least not in that sense that you mean, this moral subjectivist. And it's kind of odd he would say that because it seems like he, on the face of it, is one, but I think what he really means is that, you know, yes, you are on your own when you make this choice, but don't forget, one of the things he says very close to the beginning of the essay is that when he says we're responsible, we're not only responsible for ourselves, but we're responsible for all mankind. Or I prefer, unlike him, I like to say it before mankind, before the presence of the other. Okay, so we're not just responsible in our own isolated pod, our own sort of, you know, my mind and nothing outside of my mind, this sort of Cartesian cogito without any other content but thought itself. We always make values, Sartre's going to say, in a world that involves other people and with regarding other people, feeling anguish, feeling the despair, feeling for, you know, that all that stuff. So he's going to deny that he's a subjectivist in that sense of the word, in that sort of ethical subjectivist sense. But he does admit that existentialism, or his brand of existentialism, is subjectivism in another sense of the word. And what does he mean by this? He says, well, we are subjectivist to the extent that we existentialists, he's sort of speaking for all the existentialists now, we believe that subjectivity is the starting point and that it's impossible, absolutely impossible, to transcend your own subjectivity. What do you think he means by that when he says that no one can transcend their own subjectivity? What do you know, how would you explain that in layman's terms? What is he saying there? You can't transcend your own subjectivity? No one thinks Stan has any idea what he means by that? Chat box here.
Can you repeat that?
Well, he says that he's a subjectivist in the sense that it's impossible to transcend your own subjectivity. You, I, none of us can transcend, go beyond.
We're always gonna, so we can't be. It's not possible to be completely objective or completely unbiased.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, in a way, that's kind of the essence. That's a result of what he means, I think, because what he's saying here is you can't be in someone else. You can't switch minds with someone else, and because of that, you can't be completely objective, as you say, right? I can't switch minds with you. You know, I know I remember in the 1980s, there were all these movies, and I don't know which one was the first one because whoever did it first. It was their first idea, and all these other movies kept ripping off the same idea, but it was the same premise, and it was always a father and a son, usually sometimes a mom and a daughter, but they would wake up in the morning and they had swapped bodies. So like the mind of the boy is in the father, and the mind of the father is in the kid, and you know, so like the kid goes to school. And he's all serious, and he's like, I need to get to work, and I need to get some sales proposals in. And the teacher's like, oh, you're so cute, Jimmy, but you're being disruptive. You need to go to the principal's office. You're not paying attention to the lesson. He's like, I'm not Jimmy. I'm Jimmy's father. And, you know, and then, you know, the dad, you know, the kid is in the father's body, and he's at work, I want to play with toys, and his boss comes in, are you going to get those reports in by this afternoon? Oh yeah, I'm playing with toys, So it's like, these movies are really silly, right? One with Tom Hanks called Big or whatever, right? That was a little different premise. I think he just, I don't think it was his father he swapped with, but anyway, there's no way to do the opposite, to switch minds with each other, right? They swapped bodies, but they had the same mind. I can't trade minds with you. I'm stuck in my own mind. I'm stuck in my own consciousness, my own subjectivity. I can't escape that. I can never see the world the way another person sees me. So, like, as you put it, I can't be entirely objective. There's no way. And so this leads to the charge of solipsism. This is what comes next. It's like, aha, Sartre. So you're saying you can't transcend, you can't go beyond, you can't escape your own subjectivity. So how do you acknowledge the subjectivity of other people? That's the solipsism part. So, solipsism is the idea that there is only my mind, nothing else. Everything else is just sort of thoughts in my mind. That's where remember Descartes was there with the whole evil genius hypothesis. He didn't like it. He wanted to get the heck out of there. And so does Sartre. Most philosophers don't want to be a solipsist. That's kind of an insult to a philosopher to call him solipsistic. It's a rare breed of philosopher that will embrace this theory, right? That, only my mind exists. That's all. Everything I see is just in my mind. But no, I'm not a solipsist, he says, because even though I can't transcend my own subjectivity, I'm stuck in my own mind, I guess you could say. My own subjectivity necessarily includes, it can only be understood in terms of the subjectivity of other people. So there's nothing really positive I can say about myself as a thing, as a thinking thing, like Descartes puts, the cogito. There's nothing I can really say about myself that has any positive content to it that doesn't have reference to some other subjectivity, to some other person. Let me find the quote here where he sort of argues for this, right? That the understanding of my own subjectivity and how I understand myself is necessarily tied to someone else. Let's see here. I know I had it marked with some green ink, and I think it's on page 41 if you have the book here. It's a little bit below the halfway mark, about halfway down the page, a little bit below that. He says, the man who becomes aware of himself directly in the cogito, remember that word, the cogito, the I think, the thinking thing, the ego, the self, whatever you want to call it. The man who becomes aware of himself directly in the cogito also perceives all others, and he does so as the condition of his own existence. He realizes that he cannot be anything in the sense that we say someone is spiritual or cruel or jealous unless others acknowledge him as such. I cannot discover any truth whatsoever about myself except through the mediation of another. The other is essential to my existence as well as to the knowledge I have of myself. Under these conditions, my intimate discovery of myself is at the same time a revelation of the other as a freedom that confronts my own and that cannot think or will without doing so for or against me. We are thus immediately thrust into a world that we may call intersubjectivity. It is in this world that man decides what he is and what others are. Okay, so this term that he uses here, he gets this from I mentioned Husserl, I think, in an earlier lecture. He's the father of modern phenomenology, but this term intersubjectivity, this is something he's borrowing from Husserl. But it's the idea that it's not objective, as was it Michael that was saying this earlier, it's the idea, there's no way to be perfectly objective. Yes, so it's not objectivity, but this idea that there's something out there that can be an object for someone else. And I also can be an object for someone else. Someone can see me in a certain light, can label me. Danielle, what book are you? We're on Sartre, the last book, the only book we've got left, right? Page 43 of Existentialism as a Humanism. Um, but anyway, you're right. So intersubjectivity, not objectivity. The idea, and for Sartre, this is what gives our life meaning. If we didn't have, if the world wasn't also a world for other people, it wouldn't have the weight, it wouldn't have the significance, it wouldn't have the meaning and the value that it does for us. So, you know, this is also, and I'm going to write her name down here at the bottom, Simone de Beauvoir. I think I mentioned her last lecture. I need to spell her name correctly. Simone de Beauvoir, her and Sartre were lifelong friends, lovers, philosophical cohorts, and she wrote an essay called The Ethics of Ambiguity. She writes this essay about a year, maybe 2 years after Sartre gives this lecture, and in that essay she talks about she uses this phrase quite a lot. She uses the phrase freedom and its gratuity. So, and this is what she's talking about, is this, the need for others. So not only am I free, but I owe my freedom to the other. Not necessarily that I owe my freedom to the other, but I owe the significance, the fact that my freedom can make choices that have value. That wouldn't be the case. I might still be free if I lived on a desert island and there were no other freedoms, there were no other for itself, there were no other human beings. I would still have the freedom to do and to think and to interpret things the way I wanted to. But she and Sartre are arguing here that if there weren't other people for which that was true, then that world would be empty. That world would be shallow. That world would be without really any sort of teeth. It wouldn't really have the exigency, a word that Sartre likes to use quite a lot. It wouldn't have the urgency or the depth or the meaning or the concrete thickness. That's what she talks about, de Beauvoir. So she talks about freedom and its gratuity. What's the word gratuity mean? Anybody ever been waiting tables? I used to wait tables. I did it quite a bit getting through college, so I've heard the term gratuity quite a bit. Give that table a grat. No one knows what the word gratuity means. A tip, yeah, Rev, yeah, you got it. Yeah, it's like it's a tip or something owed for services rendered. So the idea is that yes, you're free, and that's just how you are. You exist before you can be defined. That's true. But you owe it to the other. Your freedom is kind of empty and not really, your freedom sort of empty without the other person there. There's a great episode of the Twilight Zone, which is one of my favorite old campy 1960s, early 60s, late 50s TV sci-fi shows, Outer Limits, Twilight Zone. They get all these weird, situations. And there was one episode of the Twilight Zone where this man is just a very miserable man, and he doesn't like people very much, and it shows him waking up in the morning, and he wakes up early before his alarm, I think, and he's all sleepy, and because it's so loud outside, the traffic and all the noise of this bustling city. So he gets out of bed and he starts to work, and then he finally gets to work and he's late because of all the traffic and the smog and the people. And he's just a miserable guy, and he just hates everybody, and he gets to work and everything's so busy, and everyone's smoking in the office, and he can't concentrate on his work, and he keeps getting interrupted, and he keeps wishing that everyone would just go away. He's like, yeah, he doesn't like the modern world, right, Danielle? It's just overwhelming. He needs some peace and quiet, right? I just go away. Everybody go away. Well, that happens. So he wakes up the next day, and it's been years since I watched this episode, so I don't quite remember how this happens, but I think he reads an old magic book and he learns a spell or something, and anyway, somehow everyone disappears. So he wakes up the next day and everyone's gone. There's no one left. It's just him, all alone. And at first he's very happy. You know, he's like, I got my wish, the trick worked or whatever, you know, and awesome. And I hear the birds chirping and the sunshine, and everything's great. And I'm going to go ahead and get straight to work. And he goes to work, and all that pile of papers on his desk, he just plows right through it. He even gets a head start on the next day's work. He goes home, gets a good night's sleep. And then the next day he wakes up, and I think by the time he gets to the office, he starts asking himself, why am I even working? Why am I even doing anything? And so all of a sudden he starts going crazy, he starts going nuts, and he starts hallucinating and all this stuff. But I think Sartre and de Beauvoir would have liked this episode of the Twilight Zone because it kind of demonstrates their point. If you look at what the man does, his actions, between the first day and the second day, he does the same exact thing. His actions are exactly the same. He goes to work, he, you know, whatever. I mean, the first he's miserable, right? And the second one, everything's, you know, very mechanical, but he gets all his work done. But in the second case, none of it makes sense. You know, when you watch the episode, you're kind of thinking to yourself, what the hell's he, like, you figure it out way before he does. You're like, why is he even going to work? This is really stupid. Like, he should have just taken the day off if no one exists anymore. Like, just do whatever you want. But it takes him a while to, because he hates people so much, I guess he's so relieved they're not there. But then he realizes, I need them. Like, why am I even working? I'm filling out insurance claims for people who no longer exist. And so, again, this idea that we're all on our own, for Sartre, the old saying goes, no man is an island. Yes, you're free, and you're free to define yourself as you see fit, but you can't do it in isolation, and if you try, you come up empty. And he doesn't seem to think that anything can really have value for us if there's no other people that it could have value for. And there's something about that. You know, maybe... I don't know if anyone's ever had this experience, but let's just imagine, just imagine that this happens to you. Let's imagine that you go see a movie one day. Maybe you're just bored and you got some time to kill and you're right by the movie theater. You know, maybe your friend's in this long job interview for some real serious career and they're going to take an hour and a half or whatever. So you're like, what the hell? I'm going to go see a movie. I'm bored. What's on the marquee? What's playing? And you just randomly, the one that sounds interesting, you just pick that movie. And so you go in, you watch the movie, and it's completely just blows you away. It's the most amazing film you've ever seen in your entire life. It's exciting, great acting, great cinematography, great writing, special effects. It's entertaining, it's thought-provoking. Like, it's just like blows you out of the water. This is an amazing movie, okay? Once the movie's over, right? Remember, you're all by yourself watching this film. What is the first thing you're going to want to go do? Research? You're going to go, what do you mean? You're going to go, like, look up who made the movie or what? Watch it again, says Rev. You people are selfish. Didn't I mention your friend is at the job interview and you're just waiting for your buddy to get out of the job interview and you're killing some time? You're like, I'm going to research the film. I'm going to watch it again. You don't want to tell your buddies about it? Man, no one cares. No one cares about your buddy. You don't care about you.
No,
man, you guys are no good friends, man. No good friends.
If it was a mind blowing, I wouldn't really care about my friend because I would have like, oh, dang, this movie is really good. I want to watch it again. Like, okay. I'm here anyway.
Maybe I shouldn't have said mind blowing. Maybe I should have just said it's just amazing or whatever. But yeah. I mean, they're gonna assume.
For sure, I'll tell them that it's really good, but like, I don't know.
Well, okay. Put it this way: could you keep it to yourself?
Not really. I mean, you want to share it, like tell everyone that it's really good. So.
Why would you keep it to yourself? Would anybody in here keep it to themselves? Would anybody be like, no, I'm not gonna tell anybody. That's my movie. That's my precious, my movie. You know, like who wouldn't tell their friends? Like who wouldn't? It depends. It depends on what. Daniel says it depends. So you would what if the movie was like you liked it but you thought it was really weird? You're like, man, I like it, but maybe I'm just crazy. Is that what you're thinking or something? Man, I've turned you all into a bunch of skeptics, I think. I don't know what the deal is.
It depends on if your friends are interested in the same, in whatever that movie is.
Right.
And like, not everyone will appreciate the movie the same as you did. So you have your own views on what is the best movie. So I feel like
Yeah,
it's
but
still
I
gonna be different.
I don't think Sartre is trying to say that you expect everybody else to like it the same way that you would like it. But you still, if you were really into it and you really thought it was a great movie, you might not share with all your friends. I know what you're saying. Like I like to watch foreign films, you know. I like to watch movies with, you know, like subtitles that are real artsy and deep, and they're not all fast paced. So I might watch an Ingmar Bergman movie from Sweden from 1960 that just blows me away, but I'm not going to go tell my buddy, you know, who likes to watch Marvel comic movies, which I like too. I mean, I like to go watch the Avengers and go have fun. But I mean, I see what y'all are saying, but certainly, like, if I met someone else who liked that other type of movie that I was just describing, the foreign film with the subtitles, I'd be all stoked. I'd be like, oh, cool, you like Bergman too? That's awesome. And maybe they're overemphasizing this. I tend to agree with them, but maybe I'm wrong. But they tend to think that, look, if you can't share the things that you care about with other people, and at least some other people, like, I get your points. They're all really good points, by the way, good criticisms. But, you know, if you're not able to share it with anybody, then it kind of makes life lose any meaning or any sort of, you know, you reduce yourself to just a pleasure receptacle, right? Whatever feels good, or I guess what you need to live, right? So just to survive. But if you want to have a life with purpose and meaning, you can't confine it to just yourself. I remember once when I was I was waiting tables back when I first moved to Houston. I was in grad school, and I was getting my philosophy degree, my master's at UH, and one of my coworkers, we were getting into like I wouldn't say it was a debate, but we were discussing at the time. This was when the Affordable Care Act was in Congress. They were debating, you know, Obamacare in Congress. And I'm kind of I was on the fence about it. I didn't like the way it sounded. It sounded like a big payoff for the insurance companies. I had my reservations about it, but, you know, I was on the fence. But this guy was against it. He was like, no way we should have public health care system of any kind. And his reasoning, he was studying to be a doctor. He was pre-med or whatever. And he said something like, I'm working hard to be a doctor, and people don't just deserve my services for free. They have to pay, you know? And I'm just thinking to myself, like, I think they'll still pay you if they pass this bill. I don't think part of the bill is don't pay doctors and make them work for free. I don't, but second, he said something like, I don't owe anybody anything. And then I was like, wait, hold on. You said you don't owe anybody anything? Come on, dude. Like, get real. Did you invent medicine? Did you build the medical school that you're going to go to? Did you discover all the discoveries that you're going to learn when you go to medical school? Like, you don't owe anybody anything. Like, we all owe a lot of people a lot of things, and we're just, I guess, not aware of it. I guess just, to me, it shows a lack of gratitude, right? Is that, you know, you live in a world where there's such a thing as the discipline of medicine. That involves other people, right? You have a world that involves universities, schools, that involves other people. However you define yourself, however you identify yourself, I'm a Houstonian, I'm a human being, or whatever, that involves other people, that way of classifying yourself, you know? So, you know, back to the old saying, no man is an island, right? For Sartre, so I'm not a solipsist, okay? My existence is meaningless without an acknowledgement of other people's existence. But now we get to the problem of the arbitrariness, you know, like, well, but still, you don't seem to, you know, the critic's going to say, you don't seem to give us any basis, and we're talking about the standard for judgment in a minute. you give us no basis to decide which choice would be better than another. And so what you leave us with is this sort of random arbitrariness of existence, that I could choose to be this, I could choose to be that. It doesn't really matter what I choose. And so it makes all our choices arbitrary. And Sartre uses this interesting analogy to defend this against this charge. He says, well, you're basically saying that because I won't give you some a priori blueprint, some step by numbers program of how to be a good person, or what it is to be a good person, or what's right and wrong, you're assuming that because there's no a priori choice, there's no a priori reasoning, that there's no reasoning at all, that all of our choices are just absurd. And for him, that's a false dichotomy. That's, you know, he uses this, like I said, this analogy, this example, which I kind of like. He says it's almost like our life is a work of art, or a painting, you can imagine. No one would say that a work of art, like one of Picasso's paintings, is just arbitrary, because it's not based on some universal principle or some universal law of painting. You know, imagine that someone was interviewing Picasso after he'd finished painting one of his great works, and they asked him, what rule do you follow when you paint? Every time you paint, you make these great paintings. Not always, but when you make the good ones, what rule do you follow? What is the a priori rule? I want to be an artistic genius just like you, so please tell me step by step. I've got my notepad, you know, what's the rule? And Picasso would be like, what are you talking about? Yeah, like Danielle says, they wouldn't understand him. Like, you're crazy. There is no, right? But does that mean that his painting was just random? No. It means that it was unique, and every choice was his choice. So, for instance, when Picasso was painting Guernica, you know, if you're familiar with that painting Guernica, it makes a political statement. It's supposed to be an image. It's very abstract and sort of expressionistic, but it's an image of the bombing of this small town, Guernica, in Spain, that was bombed by the Nazis. They were testing out their bombs, and Franco, the dictator of Spain, let it happen. And Picasso was a Spaniard, and he was very upset and very distraught about this event. And this painting was a response to that event. And when he painted it, I'm sure he had a general feeling or emotion or a kind of sketch in mind of what it would look like when it was finished. But he didn't have some step-by-step rule book or guidebook that he was following. You know, maybe one brushstroke led to another, right? He sketched it out. That doesn't look right. He'd make this a little bigger. This is a little smaller. This is a little darker. This is a little bit lighter. A little bit more blue here. A little bit less white here, etc. And it was just a slow process. And each choice had meaning and significance. It wasn't just arbitrary. It wasn't random. But it wasn't based on some cookie-cutter, programmatic, paint by numbers, you know, step-by-step blueprint sort of way of going about things. And so for Sartre, again, it's just because something isn't based on some universal a priori principle doesn't make it completely random. You know, when a novelist sits down to write a novel, they don't have every word in their head. They don't have every sentence in their mind, and they just sit down and write every sentence. They have a general view, and they have a general idea of the characters they'll develop. And as they write the novel, they might change some of those things and adapt. That doesn't make their choices arbitrary, but it does make them unique, and it makes them, you know, their own, and they're responsible for them, but it doesn't make them arbitrary. But how can I judge them for their choices then? How can I judge them if they decide to paint a picture that I don't like? If we're going to step outside the analogy and apply this to our lives, what if I decide to engage in a project that is really horrible? Like, I want to hurt people for, you know, I like to hurt people. I'm a sadist. You know, I want to be a murderer. You know, how can I judge a person like that? Sartre doesn't seem to give us a standard for judgment. And to a certain extent, he kind of fesses up and kind of owns up to this, shockingly, and says, honestly, I kind of can't. If you are honest about your choice, right, if you are aware that your existence precedes your essence, that you exist and you define yourself. If you feel the anguish while you're making your choice, that your choice affects other people. If you know that it's your choice, you're abandoning your choice, you're forlorn, and you're aware that things might not work out the way you want them to, and you're going to go and live with it either way. If you're honest about all these things, then Sartre doesn't have a standard of he can't judge you. It's your life, it's your existence. But he can judge you if you're in bad faith, right? If you aren't being honest about these things, and you aren't, and he's going to argue that somebody like a murderer or a serial killer or a dictator who wants to control and enslave everybody is not really being honest about all these things. They're not being honest about their anguish. They're not being honest about how their freedom is tied to the other, freedom and its gratuity. And so this leads to the last objection. Well, Sartre, why should I care about other people? Why should I give a toss about anybody else? Ultimately, it all relies on one thing that Sartre thinks is essential for any of us to value anything. There's one thing the existentialist values above all else, and Sartre argues that all of us, whether we're aware of it or not, we value it above all else too. What are we talking about here? So there's one thing, and the word is actually on your screen. So if you look at the screen, you might be able to guess for a clue there. But there's one thing that we deny. We deny we have it, or we try to fly from it. Sartre wants us to own up to it. But he says it's the one thing we have to value. Anybody have a guess of what that thing might be? Subjectivism, close. You're kind of close. My subjectivity, something about my subjectivity, something about it. What makes my subjectivity different from objects? Like this doesn't have subjectivity, this phone. Judgment, very close. What gives me the ability to make a judgment? How am I able to make a judgment? Freedom, that's it. Freedom. So for Sartre, he's going to say, why should I care about others? Well, first off, I care about freedom, whether I acknowledge it or not. We all care about something. Everybody does, right? I mean, you might only care about yourself, but you care about something. And if you care about something, it's because you're able to care about something. You have a choice for Sartre. So the only reason you're able to have any value, the only reason you're able to value anything is because you're free to value something. So if you value anything, you have to value your freedom. So that's why, whether you admit it or not, if you care about anything, you have to care about your freedom, because freedom is the possibility of having any care at all. It's a possibility of having any value at all, okay? So far, so good. So now why should I care about other people? Well, once I realize that I'm free and that my freedom is what makes me able to have values and to define myself however I see fit, once I make that realization, then I also have to realize that my freedom depends on the freedom of others. And it depends on them to such an extent that the more free they are, the more free I am. So I have to value freedom, and I have to see that freedom is tied to other people. And the more free they are, the more free I am. Now that seems to contradict what Sartre has said in his earlier philosophy in the book Being and Nothingness. We mentioned this, I think, a couple classes ago. For Sartre, we have a radical freedom. There are no limits to our freedom except facticity, right? Just the brute facts. I can't change the facts about me, what day I was born, what city I was born in. I can't walk through walls. And the only other limit to my freedom, other freedoms, other people. So it seems like other freedoms get in the way and restrict my freedom. So it seems like I would want to have less freedom for them and more freedom for myself. I'd want to be selfish. I'd want to be the ultimate dictator, the ruler of the universe, and everybody has to be my servant, right? That would be the ultimate freedom. But he's saying here, the opposite is true. That actually, the more free other people are, the more opportunities that other people have, the more possibilities, and the more aware they are of their possibilities, the better off I am, the more freedom I have. Rev says that's very vague. It is very vague. And this is one thing that really bugged me about Sartre for years. I kind of understand what he says about, okay, well, the only reason I value anything is because I'm able to value stuff. All right, I got that. So I'm only able to value it because I'm free to value it. So if I value anything, I have to value the basis for my value. And the basis for any value is freedom. I got that part. I get it. All right, so whatever. But the part that really bugs me is, well, how is it that making that guy free makes me free? Like if I'm, like, let's get a real controversial example. If I'm a slave owner, how am I more free for freeing the slave? It seems like the slave is more free. If I free the slave and I make him a free man, woman, whatever, then they have more freedom, obviously. But how do I have more freedom through them? How does that work? It's not really obvious. And it took me a while to figure out. I used to think, well, I don't know, maybe the slave owner, like, he can't exploit the slave. He can't do all this bad stuff that he can't use the slave, but maybe he's more free because he doesn't have to justify his slavery. Like, he doesn't have to justify being a bad slave owner and controlling somebody, maybe. And that, to a certain extent, I think that's on the right track. But it's not really obvious how, you know. Well, let me do one more slide here. We're coming close to the end of class, so let me try to maybe get it out of you guys, because to be honest with you, it bugged me for years. And it wasn't really until I read this essay I mentioned earlier, The Ethics of Ambiguity by Simone de Beauvoir. It wasn't really until I read that work that I was kind of like, oh, that's what they mean. And it was so obvious once I saw it. It was like, And it kind of ties into what we were saying earlier about intersubjectivity, by the way. So I should have probably, after years of pondering, I should have figured it out before having to read her. But in this book, in The Ethics of Ambiguity, she talks about positive uses of freedom. So, you know, what can you do constructively with your freedom? And she calls these indefinite conquests of existence over being. Okay. So indefinite conquests of existence over being. Very long, convoluted phrase for what she refers to as positive, constructive uses of our freedom. And there are 4 kinds of indefinite conquests of existence over being. The first one that she lists is science. The next one, technology. Then she mentions art, and then philosophy. Okay, so these are, you know, as an existentialist, what are you supposed to do with your existence? Do something, or else you're nothing. Well, what do? You either do science, technology, art, or philosophy. Maybe this is not exhaustive, and there's things they left off the list, but these are constructive uses of your freedom. She calls them conquests of existence over being. Whenever you hear an existentialist use the word existence, they're most likely talking about just human existence. So this phone doesn't exist in that sense, human existence. And being is just things that are. So when she's saying that science is a conquest of human existence over being, right? There's all this stuff in the universe, and we use our minds, our subjectivity, our existence, to examine it scientifically, to understand it, the causes of it, the laws behind it, the physical laws behind it. We use our freedom to take all this stuff and build technology with it for tools and to use and to make our life easier and to get all these tasks done. And art is where we take the content that is all the world, all the content of being, right? world that is, and we express it through art, right? We take all that content and we turn it into something creative, right? We create with it. We paint a picture of it. We write a play about it. We do a dance or something like this. And philosophy, we examine it philosophically. We question it, right? We try to answer deep questions about the why of the thing. So these are all the ways that we can engage in the world in a positive sense. And why do you think she calls these indefinite? What is indefinite about science, technology, art?
There's no limit.
Right. So there's no limit and there's no end, right? There's no like it's not like one day somebody's going to paint the last painting, right? Look, that's it. It's over. No more paintings. Why would you do another one? It's over, right? Or like all the scientists will answer every scientific question. Okay, science is done. We're done. We solved every scientific problem. It's over. All the scientists can retire now and we can just publish this 500-volume book, All Truth of Science. No, it's indefinite. It's ongoing. It's infinite. It's always expanding even. The more things we learn about science, the more questions that we have. And the more technology we develop. Somebody builds a rocket ship and now we can be astronauts. And so for her, oppression, she defines oppression as when we're cut off from these positive uses of our freedom, either by somebody who rules over us, like a king or a monarch, dictator, an oligarchic government or something like this. We're oppressed when we are prevented from engaging in these positive uses of our freedom. But she's going to argue, and so is Sartre, they're going to say that the more free I am, the less oppressed other people are, the more free I am. So if I free other people who are cut off from science, art, technology, and philosophy, if I allow them to participate, not only are they more free, it's going to make me more free. How so, do you think? Now do you have a clue? Like, how is it, like, if I'm a slave owner, let's say, before the Civil War, and I free the slaves, how am I more free? Obviously they are. They can become scientists and they can study all this stuff. I mean, I know that's a very simplistic example. It wasn't like the day after slavery they were studying science, right? It was still, we're still getting over that long convoluted past. But just to keep the example simple, right? How in the long run, in long term, how do we benefit? Even if I'm not the former oppressed group, how do I benefit? How does somebody else's freedom give me more freedom? How do other people expand my possibilities?
It's a precedent, like a standard.
Good. So you're about to say something, Reb. Do you want to jump in? I like that word precedent, though. Somebody else was going to say something, though. I don't want to step over your comment. No? But yes.
I think it's. Oh, Danielle can go. She's the one who was gonna speak. So.
Okay, good. Go for it.
What I was gonna say is like it's like even though you free your slave, you are more free because you don't have nobody to look over.
Yeah, that was sort of my first, and that's part of it. I guess that's part of it. But I think there's something even more. To me, that's more selfish. Like, this is like, it's going to benefit everybody, not just you as the former slave owner, but it's going to benefit all society. So if I allow, anybody who is oppressed to be not oppressed, to be a philosopher, to be an artist, to be, some inventor or something like that, or a scientist, I'm going to benefit. And I forgot who said this. Yeah, go ahead, Rev.
You can gain like more freedom from them as well, because more ideas, more opinions, since we're talking about indefinite conquest of existence over being. So basically their existence, their ideas exist, and then you gain from their ideas as well. So
perfect. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's basically the point, is that through their ideas, you might get ideas, and they're going to bring a perspective to the table that's their own and unique, and there's no telling what sort of innovations they might bring to the picture given their unique experience. So, any group that's been separated and oppressed once they're allowed to become a part of the whole tribe and actually participate in all these good positive uses of our freedom, then everyone stands to benefit, is the argument. It's a win-win situation, Sartre and de Beauvoir argue. So, you know, they say that, you know, like, and there is some data to back this up. I mean, I don't know if they've done a scientific study on this, but I mean, there's examples you can point to where I know I read a history of the women's movement a few years ago. I used to teach a class on women in philosophy, and I remember there was all these facts and stuff and statistics in the book, and one of them that stuck out at me was that they said that when women were allowed to do scientific research, specifically reproductive science, human reproduction, apparently, like human reproductive science advanced more in the first 15 or 20 years of women participating. It advanced in the first 15 years of letting women get involved than it had in its whole history. And so obviously, you know, you've got a group of people, of individuals, of you know, who happen to be women, and obviously they're going to have a different perspective on the cycle, the birth cycle, all that stuff, and it's going to be a lot more probably useful in that context. And so their input is going to be very, I think, helpful. You know, if you look at just historically United States, I'm thinking about specifically art, the contributions of you know, Black people in our country, African Americans. You know, I mean, if you erase that, there's another, like, it's a mockumentary that I saw, and it was years ago, but I forgot what the title of it was. I think it was The Confederate States of America, and it was this pretend documentary, like what would have happened if the South had actually won the Civil War. And it basically was showing how, I mean, it was sort of making fun of it and how horrible it would have been. And one of the main things that I think is completely, like, spot on is that it would have changed our art. It would have changed our culture. That the contributions, I think, of African Americans to American art, American literature, it's just, it wouldn't be the same. Like in the movie, like the whole counterculture movement, like, takes place up in Canada. Like Jimi Hendrix is in Canada. Like all down here, it's all like hillbilly, like bluegrass music and stuff, which I like. I mean, I like that kind of music. I mean, you know, my dad's side of the family, they're all, you know, what is it, Bob Wills and all that stuff. But I think that's pretty much all we would have that's uniquely American would be, you know, country music. But like all the stuff that, like, people associate with America, like rock and roll, you know, blues music, jazz. I mean, I really don't think a white dude could have invented that. I mean, not to knock white dudes, you know, but I don't think they could have invented it. Just the polyrhythms of the jazz music, you know, those were completely foreign for the most part to Western musical composition. And so I think it was that influence that was brought in overseas, right? And through these struggles, through their own personal struggles, this group that had been oppressed had developed their own sort of culture. And once that bled into the larger culture at large, I think it had an effect that, I mean, even if you don't like those art forms, even if, you know, I got a lot of, like, I'm a big fan of jazz, and I love blues and jazz, my favorite music. But if you're like, I don't like that stuff, yeah, but even the stuff you do like if you like rock and roll, if you like hip hop, none of that could have existed if it weren't for the innovations of jazz musicians, blues musicians, gospel singers, and all that. I think was a uniquely Black American thing that we all, I mean, before Louis Armstrong, people, like all men, would try to sing all pretty. They'd be like, I sing like this, my little buttercup girl, you know, like this just weird, you know. And then Louis Armstrong, you know, he's like, sing like this, and I don't care, you know. I mean, like, that is the basis for, like, the blues, the rock and roll vocal style. And I think that it expanded the possibilities for every musician, no matter what color your skin is, you know. And I think so anytime you let a group who has their own sort of perspective on things to kind of bring their views to the table, they're going to argue that it's just always going to be a win-win, that everyone, as far as our freedom is concerned, as far as expanding our possibilities, right, expanding the possibilities of these indefinite conquests. But anyway, so I think that's probably a good place to stop, if any. We went through all of these. Well, there's one last thing. She, you know, I was mentioning like, wait, so Sartre says that if I'm, free, the only thing that's limiting my freedom is the other freedom. What about, why wouldn't I want to be the dictator then and just limit everybody else their freedom? Simone de Beauvoir, she says that actually, if you're even successful at becoming a tyrant, if you're actually successful at becoming the dictator, you're not really free. You're actually kind of a servant. She talks about the supreme servitude of tyranny. Let's end on this. Why do you think she says that tyranny, being a tyrant, is a form of servitude? Like, in what sense? How are you a servant? If you're like Saddam Hussein, in charge of Iraq, who are you serving? It seems like he's just in charge and stuff. How is that? Even if you're the head honcho, and you got you got all the power, you actually are. Yeah, you said, as Danielle said, serving your people. Yeah, but you need to be more specific, because you could say like Saddam Hussein wasn't really serving his people. Like, he murdered a lot of his own people, but he didn't murder all of them, right? Why do you think he murdered some of his people? There's a video.
Because he didn't like what they had to say.
Right, he shut them up, but not just that. There's a video when he first came into power. There's a video of he goes to the parliament, or I forgot what kind of system they had under Saddam, but I think it was a parliamentary system. So he's going to all these like senators, congressmen, whatever, and he basically has them all there for a meeting, and he points out one guy. He says, "You're a traitor. Take him to the other room and shoot him." And he basically takes the guy out. In the next room, you can hear bullets being shot. They're getting killed. He's like, "You're a traitor too. You kill him." And everybody else that's there, that hasn't been called yet, they're all crying, and they're all like, "I love you, Saddam. I'm loyal to you. I love you. You're my favorite." So it's sort of like, but you got to imagine, like, how long could that last? And how
using death as a way to manipulate people.
Right, and so he constantly has to do this. He constantly has to play mind tricks on people. He can't be honest with them. He can't be straightforward with them. And so in a sense, he's a servant to his own power. He has to maintain that power, and in order to do it, he has to do ruthless things. And there's got to be at least a few people who will have his back. His bodyguards, his assistants. Somebody has to be benefiting, or else they won't let him. It's not like Saddam Hussein went to Baghdad one day and said, "Hey, I saw your ad on Craigslist. I heard y'all were looking for a violent dictator. I'm a really ruthless dictator that's willing to stab people in the back. Here's my resume." And they're like, "Oh, cool, hired. You're perfect," right? No, he had to work his way up the Ba'ath Party. He had to get his inner circle of loyal men who thought that he was the right leader. He had to convince some people that he was correct. And once he got to power, he had to maintain that power. There's a story of Dionysus II, who was the tyrant of Sicily back when Plato was still alive. And apparently he was so paranoid about this that he had bodyguards watching him 24/7. But once he hired all these bodyguards, because he was so paranoid, it only took like 2 or 3 weeks, and one of the bodyguards killed him in his sleep. So you have all the power, but unless you're like Superman or Dr. Manhattan, you have to please at least some people. You're not absolutely free in that sense. You are beholden to some other freedoms in some sense. You may have the illusion of being the ruler, but to sort of maintain it, you have to, like you said, Danielle, you have to serve maybe not all the people, but you have to serve at least some of the people, or at least make them think that you're serving them, so they'll protect your power. All right, well, it's been a really tumultuous semester. I'm really saddened that we have to end it today, and we can't continue next week with Nietzsche, but I get it. That's just how things are right now with the COVID-19 thing going on. And I have a feeling that it's going to get worse next semester because they're talking about another lockdown. So I know that part of the reason that there were on-campus classes is because the current administration, at the federal level, was threatening to defund the schools if they didn't have at least some in-person classes. I have a feeling the next administration will probably be more lenient on that, and I think that the administrators will take advantage of it. So I'm not saying that because I like it. I actually prefer, like I said earlier, meeting in person, but I've learned a few lessons, I guess, from this semester. So I hope next semester I'll have this Zoom thing down, kind of. But anyway, if you got here late and you didn't hear me earlier, this is it, last day of class. Next week is finals. The final essay is due on the 19th. I posted the assignment. It's on Blackboard. Everything's graded that I've got so far. So if you don't see your grade for Descartes, I haven't got the essay yet. So try to turn it in on Blackboard. If you can't, just email it to me directly. But thanks for everybody that's here. I know a lot of y'all, you're some of the few that showed up. A lot of people enrolled. Not everybody actually made the effort to come. So thanks a lot for doing that. But I guess that's it. It's 2:20, so I better just stop yapping and let you guys go. But I'll stick around. I'm not doing office hours today. So just, if you want to talk, I'm going to stop recording right now.